The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not the kind of letter a man expects. Not a bill, not a deed dispute, not another threat from the railroad's lawyers. This one came in a cream-colored envelope with handwriting so precise it looked like it had been drawn by an architect. Gideon Ashcroft held it over the lantern flame for 3 full seconds before he opened it. He almost burned it instead. The letter was from a woman named Evelyn Harrow. She had answered his advertisement in the Helena Frontier Gazette, the one his neighbor Walt Pruitt had talked him into placing half a bottle of whiskey into a particularly bad November evening. Rancher, 41, seeks capable woman for frontier marriage. No illusions offered, no illusions expected. Gideon had forgotten he'd sent it. Now, reading her careful words in his freezing kitchen, he felt the particular dread of a man who had asked for something in a moment of weakness and was about to receive it. She was coming, in 3 weeks, by train to Billings, then by stage to Harlow Creek. He read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the stove. Then he sat down and stared at the wall for a long time. If you've ever stood at the edge of a decision you can't take back, if you've ever watched something coming toward you and known there was no way to stop it, then you already understand exactly how Gideon Ashcroft felt that night. Because this is a story about what happens when two people who have already lost everything agree to try one more time, and what one ruthless man decides to do when he realizes that's exactly their greatest vulnerability. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and if you stay until the end, I promise you this: you will not see the final twist coming. The stage pulled into Harlow Creek at 11 minutes past 9 on a Thursday night in the first week of December, and the temperature had already dropped so far below zero that the driver's mustache had frozen solid during the last 4 miles of the journey. Gideon Ashcroft stood at the edge of the road with his hat pulled low and his collar turned up and his hands shoved so deep into his coat pockets that his knuckles were pressed against his thighs. He had been standing there for 40 minutes. He had arrived early because being late felt disrespectful. He wasn't sure why that mattered to him. He told himself it didn't. There were 4 other passengers on the stage, a hardware merchant from Billings who descended with the urgency of a man who needed a privy immediately, 2 brothers who ran the new assay office and spent the entire disembarkation arguing about something that had apparently begun 3 towns back, and then, last, moving without hurry, while every other person on that stage scrambled for warmth, a woman in a dark wool traveling coat who stepped down from the stage the same way a person steps off a front porch, like the ground was exactly where she expected it to be. She wasn't what Gideon had pictured. He wasn't sure what he had pictured. Something harder, maybe. Something more desperate looking. A woman who answered a frontier marriage advertisement had, in his imagination, a certain quality of last resort about her, a tightness around the eyes, a smile that worked too hard. This woman looked at Harlow Creek, at the mud-packed street and the sagging false fronts and the yellow light bleeding from the saloon windows, with the calm, assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. Then she looked at him. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. It wasn't a question. "Miss Harrow?" He took off his hat, put it back on. The wind made the gesture pointless. "There's a wagon. I'll get your trunk." "I have 2 trunks." He looked at her. "I wrote that in my second letter," she said. He had not read the second letter. He had not known there was a second letter. He had found it 3 days ago, still sealed, wedged behind the flour sack on the kitchen shelf, and had experienced a particular variety of shame he hadn't felt since he was 19 years old. "I'll get both trunks," he said. She didn't smile. She didn't make it easier for him. She just nodded once and moved to the side so he could get to the luggage boot, and Gideon Ashcroft found himself oddly grateful for that. He'd had enough of people who tried to make things easier for him. The sympathy of Harlow Creek had followed him for 3 years, and he was sick to death of it. The ride back to the ranch took an hour and 20 minutes. The trail through the foothills was badly drifted in 3 places, and the horses were tired, and the wagon had a wheel that had been making a sound Gideon intended to address and kept not addressing. They said almost nothing. At some point, around the second creek crossing, Evelyn asked how far the nearest neighbor was. Walt Pruitt, 7 miles east. And the nearest town? Harlow Creek, where we just were. A pause. The horses breathed hard steam into the darkness. I see, she said. Those were the only 2 words that might have contained anything. I see. Gideon spent the next 20 minutes trying to read them and gave up somewhere around the base of the North Ridge. The cabin was cold when they arrived. He'd banked the fire before leaving, but the temperature had dropped faster than expected, and the place had lost most of its warmth. He got the fire going while she stood in the middle of the main room and looked at everything with that same measuring gaze she'd turned on Harlow Creek. He watched her see the low ceiling, the single window with its oilcloth covering, the table with 2 mismatched chairs, the shelf of books, more than most frontier cabins had, though he'd never thought of himself as a reading man, exactly, just a man who needed something to do with long winters. He watched her see all of it and keep her face neutral, and he respected that even as it unnerved him. The bedroom is through there, he said. I'll sleep out here. She turned and looked at him then. Not surprised, not grateful, just looking. That's a good arrangement, she said. I'll make coffee if you want it. I'd rather sleep. All right. She picked up one of her trunks, the smaller one, and carried it toward the bedroom. He moved to help. She didn't stop walking. He put his hands in his pockets. At the bedroom doorway, she paused without turning around. Mr. Ashcroft. Gideon's fine. Gideon. She seemed to test the word. I want you to know that I'm not here to complicate your life. I understand what this arrangement is. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or make demands that weren't part of our agreement. He stood there with the fire starting to crack and pop behind him. All right, he said. Good night. Night. The door closed. He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he turned back to the fire and held his hands out toward it, and he noticed that his right shoulder was aching the way it always did in deep cold. And he thought about the long winter ahead, and he thought about the woman on the other side of that door, and he thought about his first wife, Clara, and how he had promised her things he couldn't keep. Then he stopped thinking about Clara because he had taught himself to do that. He made coffee anyway, even though no one was going to drink it, and he sat by the fire until it burned low, and he didn't sleep until almost 3 in the morning. Okay. The first week was archaeology. That was the only word for it. 2 people living in close quarters, each of them carefully brushing away the surface of every interaction to see what lay underneath, neither of them willing to touch anything too fragile. Evelyn was up before him the second morning. He found her at the stove, not fumbling with it the way he'd expected, but working it with efficient familiarity, like a woman who had spent years cooking on difficult equipment. He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." That was the shape of most of their conversations that first week. Short, functional, like 2 people working out the grammar of a new language, testing words before committing to sentences. She did her share of the work without being asked and without making a performance of it. She fed the chickens. She mended the tear in the feed sack that had been leaking oats for 2 weeks. She reorganized the kitchen shelf in a way that Gideon initially resented, and then couldn't argue with because everything was easier to find. On the 4th day, she asked him about the books. She had been looking at the shelf, really looking at it, reading the spines, and she asked without turning around, "Have you read all of these?" "Most of them." "Twice?" He looked up from the harness he was mending. "Some of them." She pulled one out. He couldn't see which one from across the room. She turned it over, looked at something on the back or inside cover, then returned it to the shelf exactly where it had been. "What?" he said. "Nothing." "You looked like something." She turned around. "I looked like I was reading a book." "You looked like you had a thought." She considered him for a moment with those calm, impossible-to-read eyes. "I was just noticing your taste," she said. "It's more varied than I expected." "You expected nothing but almanacs and cattle records." "I expected almanacs, cattle records, and perhaps one Bible." "I have a Bible," he said. "It's under the table leg. The floor's uneven." Something moved across her face. It was fast, and it was gone before he could name it, but he was almost certain it was the beginning of a laugh that she'd swallowed before it reached the surface. He went back to the harness, but he was aware in a way he hadn't been aware of anything in a long time, of another person being present in the room. The shoulder announced itself on day 9. He'd been splitting wood in the cold 20 minutes longer than he should have, because the storm that Walt Pruitt had predicted was 3 days overdue, and Gideon didn't trust the delay. And when he came inside, his right shoulder had locked up in that particular way it had been doing since 1887, when a horse had thrown him into a fence post and the doctor in Billings had done what he could and said the rest was up to time. Time had not been especially generous. He sat down at the table with his jaw set and his shoulder on fire, and he was in the process of deciding he was fine when Evelyn looked up from the letter she was writing. He hadn't asked who she was writing to, it wasn't his business, and said, "How long has that been happening?" "What?" "You're holding your right arm like you're afraid it's going to leave." "It's nothing." "I didn't say it was something. I asked how long." He looked at her. She looked back. She had put her pen down. 8 years, he said, because the flatness of the question made lying feel pointless. "Old injury?" "Horse." She got up from the table. He tensed the way he always tensed when people moved toward him with that particular quality of intention, that "I'm going to help you" energy that he'd learned to find suffocating. But she didn't come toward him. She went to one of her trunks, the larger one, which he'd noticed she hadn't fully unpacked, and came back with a small cloth bag that she set on the table next to him. "What's that?" "Arnica, and some other things." She sat back down and picked up her pen. "Rub it in twice a day, especially in the cold. It won't fix it, but it'll help with the inflammation." He looked at the bag. I know you don't need it," she said, without looking up from her letter. "It's sitting there if you want it." He didn't touch it that day, but that night, after she'd gone to bed, he opened the bag and smelled what was inside, and the next morning he used it. And by afternoon, the shoulder was better than it had been in months. Not fixed. Not fixed was what she'd said, and she was right, but better. He put the bag in his coat pocket and didn't mention it, and neither did she, and somehow that felt like the most honest transaction they'd had so far. The storm Walt had predicted arrived on day 11, and it arrived like it had a grudge. 3 days of wind so hard it found gaps in the cabin walls that Gideon hadn't known existed. Snow that didn't fall so much as a salt, horizontal, relentless, turning the world outside the oilcloth window into a solid white roar. The temperature dropped to places the thermometer nailed to the porch post wasn't designed to register. They were inside together for 71 straight hours. This is the thing that people who have never spent a Montana winter trapped in a small space with a stranger don't understand. It isn't the cold that tests you. Cold is simple. Cold is just a problem with a solution, so more wood, more layers, more fire. What tests you is the silence and what lives inside the silence, and what eventually has to come out of it because there is nowhere else for it to go. On the second day of the storm, Gideon's coffee went cold while he was staring at nothing and thinking about Clara, which he had told himself he wasn't going to do anymore and kept doing anyway. Evelyn said, "Where did you go just now?" He picked up the cold coffee, drank it. "Nowhere." "You've been sitting with that cup for 20 minutes. I was thinking." "About what?" He put the cup down. "My first wife." The storm howled against the side of the cabin. The fire cracked. "I didn't know you'd been married before," she said. "It was in the advertisement." It wasn't. He tried to remember the advertisement. Walt had written most of it. No illusions offered, no illusions expected. He wasn't sure what else had been in it. "Her name was Clara," he said, because the storm seemed to make certain things easier to say. "She came out here from Ohio. She thought—" He stopped. "She thought it would be different than it was." "Different how?" "She thought I'd be different than I was." He turned the cup in his hands. "She died of fever. Winter of '89. I was out checking on the cattle, and by the time I got back, she was already—" He set the cup down. "It was fast. That's what the doctor said. Like it mattered how fast it was." Evelyn didn't say "I'm sorry." He was grateful for that. He'd heard "I'm sorry" until the words had become meaningless. Just sounds people made when they didn't know what else to do with their discomfort. Instead, she said, "I was married before, too." He looked up. His name was Douglas Harrow. Her voice was level. Not the level of someone who didn't feel anything, the level of someone who had learned to carry the feeling without letting it spill. He was charming. He was persuasive. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in a room, and I was 23 and I mistook that for love. What happened? He gambled. And when the money I'd brought into the marriage was gone, he found other ways to take things from me. She looked at the fire. I left after 4 years. The law didn't make that easy. People made it harder. A pause. I won't go into all of it. You don't have to. I know. She looked back at him. I just want you to understand that I'm not here because I think marriage is a remedy for loneliness. I know better than that now. I'm here because I needed a place where I could be useful, and you needed someone to share the work. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time, and he saw the careful architecture of a person who had built walls, not out of coldness, but out of necessity, the same way he had, the same way anyone does after they've been hurt badly enough. That's honest, he said. I found honesty is more durable than kindness, she said. Kindness runs out. Honesty at least tells you where you stand. He thought about that for a long time, while the storm raged and the fire burned and the cabin held them both in its small, imperfect shelter. He didn't go back to thinking about Clara that day, not because he'd stopped missing her, but because, for the first time in 3 years, there was something else in the room that was worth paying attention to. On the 3rd day of the storm, Gideon found Evelyn at the bookshelf again, but this time she had pulled down the leather-bound ledger he kept next to the almanacs, the one with the ranch records, the land survey maps, the original deed, and she was reading it with the same concentrated attention she had given the spine of the novel 4 days earlier. He stood in the doorway. That's the ranch records, he said. She looked up, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stage in Harlow Creek, he saw something on her face that wasn't calm. It was something focused and sharp and almost worried, and she smoothed it over quickly, but not quickly enough. I know, she said. I found it while I was looking for the almanac. Is there something in it that interests you? She closed the ledger and set it back on the shelf, precisely where it had been. Your Eastern Boundary Survey, she said. The date on it. What about it? She turned around. Her face was neutral again, but her eyes weren't. The surveyor's mark, she said. Who commissioned it? Gideon frowned. Government survey. 1878. Before I bought the land. Why? She was quiet for a moment. The storm pushed against the cabin walls. The lantern swayed slightly on its hook. No reason, she said. I was just curious. And she sat back down at the table and picked up her pen, and Gideon stood in the doorway looking at her and knowing with the certainty of a man who has spent his life reading weather that she had seen something in that ledger. Something she wasn't ready to tell him, something that had frightened her. He didn't push. He went back to his chair and picked up his mending, and the storm kept blowing, and the fire kept burning, and Evelyn Harrow kept writing her letter. And whatever she had seen in the pages of his deed records, she carried it alone, her pen moving steady and sure across the page. That night, after he was certain she was asleep, Gideon took the ledger down from the shelf and opened it to the Eastern Boundary Survey and looked at it for a long time in the firelight. He looked at the surveyor's mark. He looked at the date. He looked at the section numbers and the corner posts and the notation in the margin that he had always assumed was a standard notation because he had never had reason to question it. He wasn't a man who knew much about land law or survey records or the particular language of government documentation. But he was a man who knew when something had been changed, and staring at that page in the dying firelight, with the blizzard screaming around the cabin and his wife sleeping quietly on the other side of a thin wooden door, Gideon Ashcroft felt something cold that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. He closed the ledger. He put it back. He sat very still for a long time, listening to the storm and thinking about a woman who had come to him knowing nothing about his land, and who had in 3 days of a blizzard found the one page in his records that might mean he didn't own it at all. The storm broke on a Thursday morning, and the silence it left behind was the kind that rings. Gideon was already outside before full light, working through the drifts with a shovel, clearing a path to the barn because the horses had gone 20 hours without proper attention, and that was 20 hours too long. His shoulder complained the whole time. He ignored it the way he ignored most things that complained, stubbornly, and with diminishing success. When he came back inside, Evelyn had breakfast on the table. Not elaborate. Fried cornbread, salt pork, coffee, that was actually hot for once because she had figured out on day 3 that his stove ran hotter on the left side and he had somehow never noticed that in 4 years of living with it. He sat down. She sat across from him. Neither of them mentioned the ledger. He had put it back on the shelf and she had not touched it again, and they ate breakfast in the particular silence of 2 people who have agreed, without speaking, to let something sit a little longer before they pick it up. But Gideon watched her, not obviously. Just the way a man watches weather, peripheral, patient, waiting for the signal that tells him what's actually coming. She ate without hurrying. She drank her coffee. She looked out the oilcloth window at the white wreckage the storm had made of the yard, and she said, almost to herself, "How much fence line do you think came down? North pasture'll be the worst of it. How many head do you run up there in winter? 30, 40, moved most of them south before the storm." She nodded slowly, working something through. "You do all of that alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "Walt helps sometimes, when he can get through." And before Walt, Gideon looked at her. Before Walt, there was nobody. She held her coffee cup in both hands and didn't look at him, and he had the sense she was measuring something. Not him exactly, more like the situation, the way an engineer measures load before deciding how much weight a bridge can hold. "I'll help with the fence line," she said. "It's hard work." "I noticed. I meant hard work for—" He stopped. She looked at him then, waiting. "For someone who isn't used to this kind of winter," he finished, which wasn't what he had started to say, and they both knew it. "I grew up in upstate New York," she said. "I know what cold is." He didn't argue. He'd learned in 71 hours of a blizzard that arguing with Evelyn Harrow was like arguing with a river. She didn't fight back. She just kept going in the direction she was already going, and eventually you realized you were the one who had moved. They worked the fence line for 2 days. It was the kind of work that strips conversation down to its bones. You say what needs saying and nothing else because the cold takes the rest. Post down here. Wires snapped here. Hand me the pliers. Watch that drift. It's deeper than it looks. But bone-level conversation has its own honesty. Gideon noticed that Evelyn didn't complain about the cold, didn't perform toughness for him, didn't make a show of keeping up. She just kept up. When she got tired, she said so and they rested, and when she was ready, she said that too, and they kept going. On the afternoon of the second day, working a stretch of fence along the eastern boundary, the one from the survey, she stopped. She was looking at the corner post, the one with the iron marker driven into the frozen ground beside it, the government survey marker, stamped with numbers that matched the notation in his ledger. "What are the survey numbers on your deed?" she asked. Gideon's hand stilled on the wire stretcher. "Why?" "I'm asking." He looked at her profile. She was still looking at the marker. "Section 14, Township 8 North, Range 18 East," he said. He knew them the way he knew his own name. "Southwest quarter." She crouched down and brushed snow off the top of the iron marker with her gloved hand. "Read it," stood up. "What?" he said. "The marker says Section 15. The wind moved through the bare aspens along the fence line. It was the only sound for a long moment. "That's not possible," Gideon said. He crouched down himself, read the numbers, read them again. "These markers get moved sometimes. Animals, frost heave. This one hasn't been moved," she said quietly. "Look at the ground around it. It's been here a long time." He stood up. His shoulder had gone from aching to burning without him noticing when the transition happened. "You looked at the survey in my ledger," he said. "I did." "And you saw something." She met his eyes, and this time she didn't smooth it over, didn't put the neutral expression back in place. What he saw on her face was careful and serious, and something that might, in different lighting, have been fear. "The surveyor's notation in your ledger," she said, "in the margin, the one in different ink." He had seen it, the night after the storm broke, staring at that page in the firelight. "What about it?" "That notation changes the boundary description," she said. "If someone were to argue that the notation was original, that it was part of the survey, not added later. Your southwest quarter becomes someone else's section 15. Gideon stood in the frozen pasture with the wind picking up around them and the iron marker at his feet reading numbers that weren't supposed to be there, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, exactly. Something older and harder. The feeling of a man who has worked a piece of ground for years with his hands and his back and the marrow of his bones, and who is now being told that the ground might not know his name. Who would do that? He said. She looked away back toward the cabin, which was just visible through the trees. That's the question, she said, isn't it? She told him that night. Not everything. He understood later that she told him what she'd had time to reason through, and held back what she hadn't, because Evelyn Harrow didn't speak until she was sure. He would come to know that about her. It was maddening, and it was also one of the most trustworthy things about her. They were at the table after supper, the fire good and high because they'd burned through a lot of wood in the last 2 days, and the cabin was finally holding proper heat again, and she had her hands flat on the table the way she did when she was about to say something she'd thought through. Before I came here, she said, I spent 6 years in Albany working as a legal copyist. He waited. For a land records office. She looked at her hands. I transcribed deeds, survey documents, title transfers, thousands of them, over 6 years. You learn to read those documents differently than most people do. You learn where the vulnerabilities are, where errors get made, where fraud hides. Gideon set his coffee cup down. Fraud, he said. That notation in your ledger, the one in different ink. She looked up. Someone added it after the original survey was filed. The ink is a slightly different shade, old iron gall versus something more modern, and the hand is different from the surveyor's other notations, practiced to look similar, but not the same. How sure are you? Very sure about what I saw. Less sure about what it means, she paused. But there's a pattern I've seen before. Land near a railroad route starts developing problems with its documentation. Survey errors get discovered. Boundary disputes appear. The landowners fight the legal process for months, years sometimes, and they run out of money and patience before the railroad runs out of lawyers. The fire popped. A log shifted. You think this is about the railroad, Gideon said. I think it's worth being very careful about who has access to your deed documents, she said. And I think you should know what you're carrying in that ledger, because if someone challenges your title to this land, that notation is what they'll use. Gideon got up from the table, not in anger. He didn't have anywhere to put anger right now. It wasn't useful yet. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness and the snow that glowed faint blue-white in whatever cold light filtered down from the sky. He'd bought this land in 1881. He'd broken his back on it, literally once and figuratively more times than he could count. He'd buried Clara in the South Meadow because she'd said once it was where the light came best in the morning. He'd been offered money for it twice, low money, and turned it down both times without much deliberation, and the men who'd made the offers had gone away with the flat-eyed patience of people who are used to waiting. He'd thought they were speculators. He turned around. The men who offered to buy this land, he said. 3 years ago, 2 years ago. They said they were with a land investment company. Evelyn looked at him steadily. What were their names? The first one was Harlan somebody. I don't remember the second. Did they leave cards? He tried to remember. He'd been rude to both of them, in the blunt, final way he was rude to people he wanted to be done with. He hadn't kept cards. No, he said. She nodded slowly. All right. She stood up and began clearing the supper dishes, which she did sometimes when she was thinking, kept her hands busy so her mind could work. Don't touch the ledger. Don't move anything in the survey records. If someone is building a case, they'll expect you to tamper with the documents, and that makes it worse. I'm not going to tamper with anything. I know, I'm telling you anyway. She set the plates in the basin. And Gideon, he looked at her, don't mention this to anyone. Not Walt, not anyone in town. She held his eyes for a moment. Not yet. He heard the weight in those last 2 words. Not yet meant she was thinking beyond yet. It meant she had something in mind that she wasn't ready to say. He didn't push. He'd learned that too. Oh, Walt Pruitt showed up 4 days after the storm with a mule, a broken axle on the sled he'd dragged it on, and the particular cheerfulness of a man who has been alone for 3 weeks and is delighted to see any other human face. He was 53, broad as a doorframe, with a white beard he maintained with an almost artistic consistency, and eyes that were sharper than his general air of rough good humor suggested. He had homesteaded the valley a year before Gideon, knew every rock and drainage and prevailing wind, and had the habit, which Gideon had initially resented and eventually come to rely on, of being right about things. He met Evelyn in the yard, where she was scattering feed for the chickens she had apparently made friends with, because she had names for 3 of them now, and they came when she called, which Gideon found faintly remarkable and did not say so. Walt shook her hand and said, "You must be made of something tougher than most, coming out here in December." Evelyn looked at him. "Or just more stubborn," she said. Walt laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and looked at Gideon with an expression that said, "Well, all right then." They fixed the axle together, the 3 of them, in the barn, with Evelyn holding the lantern at the angle that kept the light where it needed to be without being asked, because she could see what was needed, and she did it. Walt kept glancing at her, not impolitely, more like a man recalibrating. After the axle was done and the mule was watered and they were back inside with coffee, Walt said, with the casual delivery of a man raising something that wasn't casual at all, "You hear about the railroad survey crew?" Gideon looked up. "What survey crew?" "Came through Harlow Creek week before the storm. 6 men, proper equipment, working north of town. Pete Dobbs saw them. Said they were running lines through the Ashcroft Valley corridor." Gideon's hand was still on his coffee cup. "Nobody told me they were coming through my corridor." "That's what I said to Pete." Walt's sharp eyes moved briefly to Evelyn and back to Gideon. "Railroad doesn't always ask, you know that. Running lines isn't the same as claiming land." "No," Walt agreed. "It's not." He drank his coffee. "Just thought you should know." Evelyn said nothing. She was looking at the table, and Gideon could see from the way she was holding herself, very still, very careful, that she was filing this away alongside everything else she was already carrying. After Walt left, the yard felt quieter than it had before he arrived. "The survey crew," Gideon said. "I heard." "Is that related to the— I don't know yet." She picked up Walt's empty cup and her own and took them to the basin. "But it probably isn't coincidence." "What do we do?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "You do what you always do. You run your ranch. You don't change anything. You don't give anyone a reason to look harder at you." "And you?" She turned around. "I write some letters." "To who?" She looked at him with that measuring expression, the one he'd stopped finding unreadable because he'd learned what it meant. It meant she was deciding how much to give him. Not because she didn't trust him, because she was protecting him from knowing things that might make him act too early. "People I used to work with," she said, "in Albany." He let that sit. "Evelyn," he said, "how much do you know about this? About what they're doing?" She held his gaze for a long moment. "I know enough to be worried," she said, "and I know enough to know that worried is the right response." It was the most direct thing she had said to him since she'd stepped off that stage in Harlow Creek, and it landed in the room with more weight than anything either of them had said during 3 days of blizzard. Gideon nodded. He went and put on his coat and went back out to the barn, because there was always work that needed doing, and standing still had never been something he was good at, but his mind wasn't in the barn. His mind was in the ledger, and in the notation in different ink, and in a railroad survey crew running lines through his corridor while he'd been inside trying to figure out how to talk to his new wife. He had built this ranch on ground that had tried to kill him. Cold, drought, prices that dropped without warning, a horse that had nearly ended him, a fever that had actually ended Clara. He had held on through all of it by being stubborn and careful and unwilling to let the land defeat him. He was not going to lose it to ink. January moved the way January always did in that valley. Slowly, with a kind of grinding relentlessness, each day a little shorter on warmth than the one before, even when the calendar said it should be heading back. They fell into a rhythm, the way people do when the world shrinks to a cabin and a barn and a yard between them. Gideon handled the livestock and the heavy outdoor work. Evelyn managed the house and what he'd started privately thinking of as the intelligence operation, which was not a phrase he would ever have used out loud, but which was accurate. She wrote letters. She received letters, carried up on horseback by Pete Dobbs' oldest boy, who ran mail for the North Valley ranches in winter. She read them at the table with that concentrated expression and then folded them small and tucked them somewhere in her larger trunk. He didn't ask, but he watched her face when she read them, and he learned to read her the way he read the sky, not the words, but the weather underneath. Most of the letters left her face neutral. That was baseline. A few made something tighten around her eyes, which meant the news was worse than expected. And once, the third week of January, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the oilcloth was the particular flat white of deep cold, she read a letter and then set it face down on the table and sat very still for almost a full minute. He was mending leather on the other side of the room, and he put it down. "Bad?" he said. She picked up the letter. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "The two men who offered to buy your land, the ones you called speculators." She turned the letter over. "Did either of them mention a company called the Meridian Land and Survey Trust?" He pulled that name from his memory, which was the kind of memory that held things whether he wanted it to or not. "No," he said, "but there was a letterhead on the first offer, something with Meridian in it." She closed her eyes, just for a moment. "All right," she said. "What is Meridian?" She opened her eyes. "It's a holding company," she said, "nominally independent, actually a subsidiary of the Northern Cascade Railroad." She looked at the letter in her hands. "A contact in Albany tells me Meridian has filed what they're calling a corrective survey claim on approximately 40 acres in Section 15 of Township 8 North." The numbers hit him like cold water. "That's my land." "Yes. They've already filed. 3 weeks ago." She set the letter down. "Before we found the boundary marker." Gideon stood up. He didn't mean to. It just happened. His body making the decision before his mind caught up, the old animal response to threat that cattle ranching either refines or destroys, depending on the man. He walked to the window. The yard was empty. The snow was unmarked. 3 weeks ago, he said, when they had their survey crew in Harlow Creek. "Yes. So they were already moving while I was still—" He stopped. "I had no idea any of this was happening." "That's usually how it works," she said, and her voice was quiet and without judgment, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. He turned around. "What does the filing mean, practically? What happens next?" "They'll serve notice," she said, "probably within the next few weeks. They'll claim the corrective survey reveals a boundary error in the original 1878 documentation. They'll say the error was always there, that you've been occupying their land unknowingly, and they'll offer to settle." "Settle for what?" "For a portion of the land, probably. Maybe a right-of-way through the eastern pasture." She paused. "That's the route their line needs to take. Eastern pasture, through the canyon, up to the Pryor Creek Junction." He understood then, all of it, the full shape of it. The survey crew. The notation in different ink in a ledger that had sat on his shelf for years, waiting for someone to need it. The offers that had come before, too low, building a record of a reluctant seller. The filing already made 3 weeks back, machinery already in motion. "They're not offering to settle," he said. "They're offering to let me walk away with something instead of nothing." "That's a generous way to describe it," she said. "But yes." He stood there in the middle of his own kitchen and thought about the land and about Clara in the South Meadow and about 8 years of waking up before light to work ground that had cost him more than he'd expected and less than it was worth. And he thought about the kind of men who did this, who moved paper around and changed ink and filed documents in offices hundreds of miles away, and believed, with the serene confidence of people who had never lost anything they couldn't replace, that every piece of ground in the West was just a transaction waiting to happen. "I'm not settling," he said. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, but something closer to relief, which confused him until he thought about it later and understood that she had been waiting to see what kind of man she'd married, and now she knew. "No," she said, "we're not." He looked at her. though we landed differently than he expected, clean and definite, like a well-driven nail. "Can we fight it?" he said. "Legally, do we have enough?" She folded the letter and set it on the table between them. "Tell me everything you remember about when you bought this land," she said. "Who the seller was, what documents you signed, who witnessed the signing, every detail you can bring back." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her and started talking, and she listened with the focused, total attention of someone building something in their mind, asking questions at intervals, quiet, precise questions that pulled at threads he hadn't known were loose. And outside, the January cold pressed against the cabin walls, and the fire burned between them, and for the first time since he'd driven out to meet a stagecoach on a freezing December night, Gideon Ashcroft did not feel like he was fighting a lonteton. Dikin. The notice arrived on a Friday. It came with a man. Not a local man, not anyone from Harlow Creek or the surrounding valley. He arrived on a black horse in the early afternoon, wearing a coat that was too good for the weather and an expression that had clearly been arranged to suggest regret while communicating the opposite. His name, according to the documents he produced, was Mr. Aldous Fenwick, representing the Meridian Land and Survey Trust, and by extension, the Northern Cascade Railroad's legal interests in the matter of the corrective boundary survey for Section 15. He handed Gideon a thick envelope at the porch door, explained its contents in the smooth, practiced language of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped registering as bad, and said that Meridian was prepared to offer fair compensation for any inconvenience caused by the boundary correction. Gideon didn't open the envelope. He looked at Fenwick for a long moment, at the good coat, the arranged expression, the horse that was worth more than most homesteaders' entire operations. "Who altered the survey notation in my deed records?" he said. Something moved across Fenwick's face. Quick, controlled. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said. "Yes, you are." Fenwick adjusted his gloves. "Mr. Ashcroft, I understand this is upsetting. These boundary corrections can feel—" "I didn't ask you how it feels," Gideon said. "I asked you who altered the notation." From inside the cabin, barely audible, Evelyn's voice. "Gideon?" He looked back. She was standing 3 feet behind him, just inside the doorway, and she gave him a very small, very clear shake of her head. He turned back to Fenwick. "You'll get an answer to this," he said, and he held up the envelope. "Through the appropriate channels, whatever those are." Fenwick nodded. "Meridian looks forward to resolving this matter efficiently." He turned his horse. "Good day, Mr. Ashcroft." Gideon watched him ride down the track until the tree line swallowed him. Then he went inside and closed the door and put the envelope on the table without opening it and looked at Evelyn, who had her arms crossed and her face set in the expression he was learning to read, as "I have a plan, but I need more time." "Don't tell them what we know," she said. "I didn't." "You came close." "I wanted to see his face." She looked at him. "What was on it?" "He knew exactly what I was talking about," Gideon said. "He didn't even try very hard to look confused." She absorbed that, nodded once. "Good," she said quietly. "That's actually good." She sat down and pulled the envelope toward her and opened it with the same careful precision she brought to everything, not tearing, not rushing, and began to read. Gideon watched her read. He watched her eyes move across the pages steadily, without expression, the way they always moved when she was working through something complicated and didn't want whatever she was feeling to get in the way of what she was thinking. She finished the last page and set it down. "They've attached a copy of their corrected survey," she said, "and an affidavit from a man named Calvin Reed, who describes himself as a licensed government surveyor." "Is he?" "Probably." She tapped the last page lightly with one finger. "The affidavit says the notation in question is original, that it was there when the survey was filed in 1878. "It's not. You said so." "I know what I said." She looked up. "The problem is that I'm a woman who worked as a legal copyist, and Calvin Reed is a licensed government surveyor with an affidavit. In a court of law, that matters." The word court sat in the room. "You think it goes to court," Gideon said. "I think they're counting on it not going to court," she said. "They're counting on you doing what most men in your position do, which is look at their lawyers and their documents and their money and decide that fighting is too expensive and too exhausting. They're wrong about that. I know they are. She looked at him steadily. But being right and being able to prove it are two very different things, Gideon. And right now we need something they aren't expecting. She stood up and went to her trunk, the larger one, the one she still hadn't fully unpacked, and knelt in front of it and opened it. He had not looked inside it before, had not considered it his business, but from where he stood he could see now that it was mostly papers. Folders, bundled documents, tied with ribbon or cord, organized in a way that looked deliberate and dense. She found what she was looking for near the bottom, a folder, thicker than the others, tied with a dark cord. She brought it to the table and set it next to Fenwick's envelope. "I've been collecting information on Meridian for 3 weeks," she said, "since your neighbor mentioned the survey crew." He looked at the folder, then at her. "You were already building a case," he said. "I was already building the beginning of one." She opened the folder. The papers inside were covered in her precise handwriting, interspersed with letters and what looked like copied documents. There are 4 other ranches in 2 territories where Meridian has filed corrective survey claims in the last 5 years. 3 of them settled. 1 fought and lost because they didn't know what they were looking at. And the notation in the surveys? She met his eyes. All 4 had similar marginal notations, she said. Different ink, different hand from the original surveyor. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had picked up again, so not storm wind, just the steady January wind that was simply part of the landscape up here, the valley's constant conversation with itself. Gideon looked at the folder. He looked at his wife, kneeling in front of a trunk that turned out to be full of evidence she had been quietly, carefully gathering since before she had any reason to trust him. He thought about the second letter he hadn't read, wedged behind the flour sack. He thought about her stepping off that stage and looking at Harlow Creek like she was taking inventory, and he understood now that she had been doing exactly that. Not of the town, but of the situation she was walking into, which she had already begun to understand before she ever arrived. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "How long did you know about Meridian before you came here?" The question landed between them. She held it for a moment, and he could see her deciding not whether to lie to him. He'd already learned she didn't do that, but how to be honest in a way that was fair to both of them. "I knew something was happening in this valley," she said. "The advertisement you placed. It was the right location, the right timing. I had contacts who knew what Meridian was doing in this territory." She paused. "I didn't know it was your land specifically until I read the survey records in your ledger." "So you came here with a purpose?" "I came here because I needed somewhere to go and because I thought I might be able to help," she said. "Those 2 things don't cancel each other out." He stood there with that. It should have felt like betrayal. A woman who had arrived with an agenda, who had looked at his crisis before she'd looked at him. Part of him reached for that, the old defensive anger that had been his first response to most things for 3 years. But another part of him, the part that had been watching her work beside him in the freezing pasture and listening to her think through problems at the kitchen table, and watching her read Fenwick's documents with the focused precision of someone who actually knew what they were looking at, that part understood something different. She hadn't come to use him. She had come because she could do something that he couldn't, in a situation that was already in motion before either of them arrived at it, and she had made a gamble on a stranger that wasn't so different from the gamble he'd made on her. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. No qualification, no defense. "I should have." He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me what we need," he said. She opened the folder, and in the yellow lantern light with the winter wind working the eaves and the fire burning low and steady behind them, Evelyn Harrow, who had come to him in darkness and cold with 2 trunks and careful eyes and a past she carried quietly, began to explain exactly what she intended to do about the men who were trying to take his land. And Gideon Ashcroft, who had spent 3 years fighting everything alone, listened. What Evelyn laid out that night was not a plan so much as an architecture. She spread her documents across the table the way a builder spreads blueprints, not to impress, but to see the whole shape of the thing at once. And what Gideon saw, looking at months of careful work arranged in the lantern light, was that his wife had not arrived in Montana carrying hope. She had arrived carrying preparation. The folder contained copies of 4 corrective survey claims filed by Meridian in Wyoming and Dakota Territory over the previous 5 years. She had obtained them through former colleagues in Albany, through a land records clerk in Cheyenne she had corresponded with for 3 weeks, and through one contact she referred to only as a man who used to work for the railroad and has reasons of his own to want this documented. Each claim followed the same pattern: a marginal notation appearing in an original survey document, a corrected boundary filed by a Meridian-affiliated surveyor, a notice served to the landowner, a settlement offered before the case could reach a judge. 3 out of 4 had settled. The one that didn't settle, Gideon said. What happened? The landowner hired a lawyer in Cheyenne. Good man, apparently. But Meridian had 6 lawyers, and the patience that comes from having a great deal of money. She smoothed the edge of one document with her thumb. The case dragged for 14 months. The landowner ran out of funds to continue. The court found in Meridian's favor on a procedural issue, not even on the merits. Procedural. They missed a filing deadline. Their lawyer was sick. It was... She stopped. It was bad luck on top of a bad situation. Gideon looked at the documents. So they win by making the fight too expensive. That's the mechanism, yes. But the mechanism only works if you fight the way they expect you to fight. She looked up. A long legal battle with hired counsel, stretched across months, bleeding money until you give up. That's their playbook. They've run it 4 times. What's ours? She folded her hands on top of the papers. We don't give them time to use it, she said. We take this to a judge before Meridian finishes building their case. We file a counter-challenge to the corrective survey, and we attach evidence that the boundary notation is fraudulent. She paused. And we do it before they expect us to understand what we're looking at. He worked through the timeline. How long do we have? Their filing gives us 60 days to respond. That sounds like room to breathe. It isn't. She pulled a sheet from the folder. Dates written down a page in a column. They'll use those 60 days to reinforce their position. More affidavits. More documentation of the corrected boundary. They'll make Calvin Reed's testimony look airtight. She tapped the date at the bottom of the column. We need to move in 30. 30 days. Ideally 25. He looked at her. And the evidence? What we have right now, your comparison of the ink, the pattern from the other claims, is that enough? This was the question she had been waiting for him to ask, and he could see she had been waiting for it because her answer was already formed. Not yet, she said. We need one more thing. She reached into the folder and produced a single sheet, a name and address written in her hand. Below the name, 3 lines of tight notation that he couldn't read from across the table. He reached for it. She let him take it. The name was Thomas Aldred, an address in Billings. Who is he? Gideon said. He was a government surveyor, she said. He worked the northern Montana Territory from 1875 to 1882. He surveyed most of the land grants in this valley. She let a beat pass. Including yours. Gideon looked at the paper. He did the original 1878 survey, he said. Yes. Is he still? He's alive. He's 61. He retired to Billings 4 years ago. Her voice stayed level. My contact in Albany found him. He has never spoken publicly about his survey work in this valley, but my contact believes, based on a conversation he had, carefully, that Aldred knows the notation in your deed is not his. The fire had burned down while they talked, and the room had gone slightly colder, and neither of them had noticed. Gideon set the paper down. He knows someone altered his work, he said. I believe so. And he said nothing. He's 61 years old and he lives alone in Billings, she said quietly. Saying something would mean saying it in public, on record, in front of a railroad company with more lawyers than he has years left. Gideon understood. He understood it in his body, the weight of that. A man who knew the truth and had been carrying it in private because the cost of speaking it seemed too high. He had no contempt for Thomas Aldred. He had, in fact, a feeling close to pity, which was uncomfortable because pity required imagining yourself in someone else's position, and he could imagine it very clearly. We need to go to Billings, he said. You need to go to Billings, she said. I need to stay here and finish the documentation on the other 4 claims, and She paused. Someone needs to watch the land. He looked at her. Walt, he said. Walt, she agreed. He told Walt the next morning, not everything, not Evelyn's history, not the full depth of what she'd built in that folder, but enough. The corrective survey filing, the notation, the pattern across 4 other claims. Walt listened with his coffee going cold in his hand and his face doing the thing it did when he was angry and trying to be useful instead of just angry, which involved a particular stillness around his jaw. When Gideon finished, Walt said, "How long have you known?" "Few weeks?" Walt looked at him for a long moment. "You could have told me." "She said to be careful about who—" "I'm not who," Walt said. "I'm Walt." Gideon took that. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you now." Walt set down his cup. "What do you need?" "Eyes on the place while I'm in Billings. 2, maybe 3 days." "Done." Walt picked up his cup again, realized it was cold, set it back down. "This Evelyn of yours, she knows what she's doing?" Gideon thought about the folder, the dates, the 4 other claims, the name and address of a retired surveyor in Billings that she'd found through a network of contacts she'd built over 6 years of legal copy work. "Better than either of us," he said. Walt absorbed that with the equanimity of a man who had long ago made peace with other people knowing things he didn't. "All right then," he said. "Go to Billings. I'll watch the north pasture." Gideon left before first light on a Monday, 2 days after the conversation with Walt, riding the better of his 2 horses because the road to Billings was long and the road was not kind in February, and arriving with a worn-out horse was the kind of disadvantage he couldn't afford. Evelyn had written Thomas Aldred a letter. She'd composed it at the table the night before Gideon left, 3 drafts of it, each one shorter than the last, until what remained was a single paragraph that said almost nothing and implied everything. She had not used her own name or Gideon's name or the word meridian. She had written it as an inquiry from a party interested in the survey records of the 1878 Northern Valley land grants with a request to discuss a matter of professional documentation. "It's vague," Gideon said, reading it. "It needs to be. If Meridian has someone watching him, and they may, a letter that says too much puts him back inside before we can get him out." She folded it and sealed it. "But a man who knows what he knows will understand what this is asking." He didn't argue. He was beginning to understand that arguing with Evelyn's reasoning wasn't usually about the reasoning. It was about the feeling of being the person in the room who understood least, which was a feeling he disliked and needed to get over. He tucked the letter in his coat and rode south into the cold. Billings in February was gray and deliberate. The streets were packed hard with old snow and the buildings had the closed, enduring quality of everything in Montana in winter. Not unfriendly, just focused on getting through. Thomas Aldred lived in a narrow house on a side street 3 blocks from the land records office where he had filed more than 200 surveys in his working years. The house was maintained but not dressed up. A man's house, without the touches that came from someone else caring about it. A woodpile, well stacked. A front step, recently swept. Small dignities. Gideon knocked. The man who opened the door was shorter than Gideon had imagined and wore the look of someone who had spent 30 years outdoors and then stopped, which left a particular quality of weathered restlessness. His eyes were blue and careful, and they moved from Gideon's face to his coat to his hands and back to his face in about 2 seconds. "Mr. Aldred," Gideon said. "My name is Gideon Ashcroft. I believe my wife wrote you a letter." Something crossed Aldred's face. It was there and gone in less than a second, but Gideon was watching for it, and he saw it, not surprise. Something closer to the expression of a man who has been waiting for a knock on a particular door for a long time and is not entirely sure whether to be relieved or afraid that it has finally come. Aldred stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was organized the way the exterior suggested. Functional, exact, without waste. Books on the shelves by subject, maps rolled and labeled in a wooden stand by the window. A drafting table pushed to the side but not put away, as though Aldred had intended to stop using it and hadn't quite managed to convince himself. They sat at a small table near the stove. Aldred said, Your land is in Section 14. Not a question. Southwest quarter, Gideon said. Aldred folded his hands on the table. They were a surveyor's hands, still precise in the joints, whatever his age. You got a notice from Meridian. Filed 60 days ago. Aldred was quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Outside, a wagon went past. How did you find me? He said. My wife has contacts in Albany. She was a legal copyist for 6 years. Something shifted in Aldred's expression, a careful recalibration. She knows what she's looking at then. She knew about the notation before I did, Gideon said. Different ink, different hand. Aldred got up and went to the window. He stood looking out at the gray street with his hands behind his back, and Gideon let him stand there because he had the instinct, born from years of dealing with difficult animals and difficult weather, which required the same fundamental patience, that pushing now would close a door that was currently open. After a long moment, Aldred said, I filed that survey in October of 1878. I have my field notes, every measurement, every corner post. He paused. The notation in the margin was not in my notes. It was not in my filing. When did you find out? Aldred turned around. 1889, he said. A man came to see me, said he was doing a records audit for the territory, asked me to confirm the details of several surveys. When I looked at the copies he brought, the notation was there. He came back to the table but didn't sit. I told him it wasn't mine. He thanked me very politely and left. And then nothing happened? Nothing happened for 2 years. Aldred finally sat down. Then a colleague of mine in Cheyenne, a surveyor I'd worked with for 15 years, told me his testimony had been used in a Meridian boundary case. His original survey against a corrected one with a notation. He hadn't known his name was being used. When he tried to object, he was told the original filing spoke for itself. His voice was level, but the levelness was doing work. He lost the contract he'd had with the territory government within a year. Procedural irregularities, they said. Gideon sat with that. They destroyed his career, he said. They made an example. Aldred looked at him directly. I have field notes that prove the notation is not original. I have always had them. But field notes from a retired surveyor against the full weight of a railroad corporation's legal team. He stopped. Your rancher in Wyoming, his case ran 14 months. I know about that case. Aldred studied him. Then you know how it ended. I know how Meridian wanted it to end, Gideon said. My wife doesn't think it has to go that way. Aldred looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something Gideon hadn't expected. What's her name? Your wife? Evelyn? Evelyn Ashcroft, born Harrow. Aldred was quiet. Then, slowly, I received a letter 8 months ago from a woman inquiring about the survey patterns in the Northern Montana Territory grants. She didn't sign her name. He looked at Gideon. She was already working on this before she came to you. Gideon held that. Yes, he said. She was. Why? Gideon thought about a woman who had left a bad marriage and spent 6 years in a legal copy office learning to read documents the way other people read faces, building a body of knowledge that had nowhere useful to go until she found a place where it was needed. Because she could, he said, and because nobody else was. Aldred sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at his hands, then at Gideon. If I testify, he said, I need to know that the case is prepared well enough to survive Meridian's response. They will question my competence, my memory, my motives. They will produce their own surveyors and their own documentation. My field notes are necessary, but they are not sufficient. My wife has documentation on 4 other Meridian claims, Gideon said. Same pattern, same notation style. She's been building the comparison for weeks. Aldred's careful blue eyes didn't move from Gideon's face. The ink analysis, he said. Has she had anyone else look at it? Not yet. There's a document examiner in Helena, a man named Birch. He works for the territory courts. He has done ink analysis on contested documents before, and his testimony carries weight. Aldred leaned forward. If Birch examines your original deed and confirms what your wife saw, different composition, different age, that changes the character of the case entirely. It moves from a boundary dispute to a fraud claim. The words sat in the room. Fraud against the territory, Gideon said slowly. Against the landowner and against the integrity of the public land records. Aldred's voice was still level, which is a different order of thing than a civil boundary dispute. A fraud claim brings different authorities into the picture. Gideon thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table with the folder spread before her, explaining that they needed to move before Meridian expected it. He thought about what she'd said. We don't give them time to use their playbook. He thought about the difference between a boundary dispute, which Meridian had run 4 times and won 3, and a fraud claim against a railroad corporation's land subsidiary, which was an entirely different fight with entirely different stakes. She didn't mention Birch, he said. She may not know about him. He's relatively new to the territory courts. Aldred stood up and went to the drafting table and came back with a card. Tell her to contact him before she files anything. If his examination confirms the ink composition, file the fraud claim alongside the boundary challenge. He set the card on the table. That's what I would do. Gideon picked up the card. Mr. Aldred, he said, will you testify? The clock ticked. The stove breathed. Thomas Aldred, who had carried the knowledge of what had been done to his work for years, who had watched a colleague lose everything for trying to push back, who had lived with the particular weight of a man who knows the truth and has not yet spoken it, sat across from a rancher he had met 40 minutes ago and thought about all of that. Yes, he said, but I want it done right. I want Birch's examination, and I want your wife's documentation complete before any of us walks into a courtroom. He looked at Gideon. Can she have it ready in 3 weeks? Gideon thought about the woman who had reorganized his kitchen shelf and mended the feed sack and kept her pen moving through a blizzard and arrived with 2 trunks, one of them full of evidence she'd spent months gathering before she'd ever met him. 2, he said. He rode back to the ranch in one long day, pushing the horse harder than he liked because he had things to tell her, and the ride gave him too much time to think about them. What he thought about, mostly, was not the case. He thought about the 8 months. The letter she had sent to Aldred under no name, 8 months before she had answered his advertisement in the Helena Frontier Gazette. 8 months of working towards something that had led her, eventually, to him. And he tried to sort out how he felt about that, whether it felt like deception or like something more complicated, a woman who had found a path that served more than one purpose and had taken it without apology. He thought about what she had said. I came because I needed somewhere to go and because I thought I might be able to help. Those 2 things don't cancel each other out. He thought about Clara, which he was still doing even though he kept deciding to stop. He thought about how Clara had come to Montana for him and had found the place harder than she expected and hadn't had the tools to adapt, and he had not known how to help her, and she had died before either of them figured it out. He thought about how much of his life since had been shaped by that failure. The isolation, the refusal of help, the advertisement placed in a moment of weakness that he'd almost burned before reading. He thought about a woman who did not come to Montana for him, who came with her own reasons and her own tools and her own agenda that happened to intersect with his need in a way that might, if they were both careful and both lucky, save his land and give them both something worth staying for. It wasn't a love story. He wasn't sure he believed in those anymore, but it was something. It was something real and complicated and worth paying attention to, which was more than he'd had in 3 years. But he got back to the ranch after dark. Walt's horse was gone from the yard, which meant Walt had checked the north pasture and gone home, which meant everything was in order. The light was on in the cabin. He came through the door and Evelyn looked up from the table where she was working, papers spread around her, a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, the way his had that morning he'd sat thinking about Clara. She read his face. He'll testify, she said. Not a question. He'll testify. Gideon took off his coat and hung it. He wants Birch's examination first. Document examiner in Helena, works with the territory courts. He set the card on the table in front of her. Ink analysis. Aldred says if Birch confirms the composition difference, we file a fraud claim alongside the boundary challenge. Evelyn picked up the card. Read it. Something happened to her expression. Not surprise. She was past surprise. Something more like the look of a person who has been pushing at a door for a long time and has just felt it move. Fraud changes the jurisdiction, she said. That's what Aldred said. It brings the territory attorney general into the picture. She set the card down. Meridian can outspend a civil boundary challenge. They cannot as easily outspend a fraud investigation with the weight of the attorney general behind it. Can we get the attorney general interested? If Birch's examination confirms the notation is altered, and we attach Aldred's field notes and the pattern across 4 other claims, she looked at the papers spread around her. Yes, I believe we can. Gideon pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. Aldred asked for 3 weeks, he said. I told him 2. She looked up sharply. Gideon, can you do it? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the papers around her, the weeks of careful work, the columns of dates, the copied documents from Wyoming and Dakota Territory. I'll need the original deed, she said, and you'll need to ride to Helena to get Birch. I'll leave Thursday. She nodded slowly. Then she pulled the nearest stack of papers toward her and uncapped her pen. I'll need more lamp oil, she said. He almost smiled. I'll get it. He got up and found the oil and refilled the lamp while she bent over the papers and began to write. And the cabin was warm and the night outside was cold and deep, and somewhere to the south, the railroad lawyers were sitting in their comfortable offices, believing they had run this play before and knew exactly how it ended. They did not know about Thomas Aldred's field notes. They did not know about a document examiner named Birch. And they absolutely did not know about the woman at the kitchen table, writing in the lamplight with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting years for the right moment to use everything she knows. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not from Meridian, not from Albany or Billings or anywhere Gideon would have expected. It came with the regular mail carried by Pete Dobbs's boy, and the return address was a law firm in Helena, Carver and Stroud, attorneys at law. And the letter inside informed Gideon Ashcroft that he had 30 days to vacate the eastern pasture pending resolution of the corrective boundary survey, as the disputed acreage had been temporarily enjoined by order of the Cascade County District Court. Temporarily enjoined. Gideon read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Evelyn without speaking. She read it once and set it down. They move faster than I expected, she said. They got a court order. A temporary one. Probably a sympathetic judge. Her voice was calm but thin at the edges. They're trying to establish physical possession of the disputed acreage before we can challenge the survey. She looked up. If they can show a court that they have been exercising rights over that land, even temporarily, even under a contested order, it complicates our position. I'm not vacating my pasture, Gideon said. I know. She stood up. But if you don't comply with a court order, they can use that too. So what do we do? She was already at her trunk, pulling out the folder, adding the new letter to it with the precise, deliberate movements of someone who is angry and will not let the anger be faster than the thinking. We stop waiting for Thursday, she said. You ride to Helena tomorrow. You find Birch, and you get him to come here and examine the deed. And she stopped. I need to write to someone. Who? She turned around. And for the first time since that stage had pulled into Harlow Creek and she had stepped down from it without hurrying, Evelyn Ashcroft looked afraid. Not paralyzed. Not defeated. Just afraid. The way a person looks when they understand exactly what is coming and are measuring themselves against it with clear eyes and no illusions. A man named Carver, she said. He's the senior partner at the firm that just sent this letter. She held his gaze. I know him. From Albany. A pause. He knows me. Gideon waited. He knows what I know, she said. About how to read these documents. About what this notation means. Her jaw set. He's done this before. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he knew, when he took this case, that if anyone on the opposing side understood the documentation, it would be a problem. She looked at the letter. This injunction isn't just strategy, it's a message. The room was very quiet. He's warning you, Gideon said. He's warning me, she said, that he knows I'm here, that he knows what I'm building, and that he intends to move quickly enough that it won't matter. Gideon stood up. His shoulder was aching. The cold was in the walls again, that deep February cold that found every gap. Outside his pasture, his eastern pasture, where he had strung fence and broken ground and moved cattle for 11 years, was apparently now subject to a court order he had not been given time to contest. He thought about the kind of men who did things this way, who moved paper around in offices and sent polished men like Aldred Fenwick on good horses to serve notices and obtained court orders through sympathetic judges before the other side had time to understand what was happening. Men who had done this 4 times already. Men who believed, with the unshakable confidence of people who had never run out of money in the middle of a fight, that the outcome was already settled. He crossed to the table and picked up the injunction letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "Write your letter to Carver," he said. "Tonight." She looked at him. "Tell him we've retained a document examiner and a material witness," he said. "Tell him we're filing a fraud challenge in the territory court, not a boundary dispute." He held her gaze. "Tell him we know about Wyoming and Dakota territory and that the pattern is documented." Evelyn's eyes moved across his face. "That will make him move faster," she said. "I know. It will force their hand." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "But you said it yourself. They're counting on us doing what they expect. A scared rancher and a wife who maybe knows a little too much for comfort." He paused. "Show them we already know everything." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she went to the table and sat down and took out a fresh sheet of paper and uncapped her pen. "It'll be the most important letter I've ever written," she said. "You'll write it well," he said. She looked up at him. And this time what moved across her face was not fear, not the careful blankness she had worn since Harlow Creek, not the measuring gaze of a woman deciding how much to trust. It was something simpler and more unguarded, and it lasted only a moment before she looked back down at the paper. But Gideon had seen it. He turned and went to put more wood on the fire, because the cabin was cold and she was going to be writing for a long time, and that was the most useful thing he could do, and doing useful things was how Gideon Ashcroft expressed most of what he felt that he didn't yet have language for. The lamp burned, the pen moved, the winter pressed against the walls. And 30 miles away in an office in Helena, a railroad lawyer named Carver would open his mail in the morning and find a letter that would tell him, for the first time in 5 successful cases, that someone on the other side understood exactly what he had done. Carver's response came in 4 days. Not by mail, by messenger. A young man on a fast horse who arrived at the ranch on a Saturday morning and handed Gideon a sealed envelope with the practiced neutrality of someone paid not to have opinions about what he was carrying. The envelope was good stock. The seal was wax, dark red, pressed with the firm's initials. Everything about it communicated the same thing. We are not hurrying because we are afraid. We are hurrying because we choose to. Gideon brought it inside without opening it. Evelyn was at the table. She had been at the table for most of the last 4 days, sleeping in short intervals that she clearly considered adequate and that Gideon privately considered insufficient, rising before light and working until the lamp oil ran low. Her handwriting, he had noticed, did not deteriorate when she was tired. Most people's did. Hers stayed exact, which told him something about the discipline underneath the surface that he had only been glimpsing until now. She looked at the envelope. "Read the return address." "Open it," she said. He did. The letter was 2 pages, dense with legal language that Gideon could parse in parts and not in others, but the architecture of it was clear enough. Carver and Stroud, on behalf of the Northern Cascade Railroad and its subsidiary, the Meridian Land and Survey Trust, were prepared to offer a revised settlement. The terms had changed from the original notice. The railroad no longer sought to claim the eastern pasture outright. Instead, they proposed a permanent right-of-way easement through the disputed acreage, with a payment to Gideon of $400, described as fair compensation for inconvenience incurred during the boundary correction process. $400, and the right to run their line through his land forever. Gideon read it twice, put it on the table in front of Evelyn, and went and stood by the window. She read it once. "They're scared," she said. He turned around. That's a settlement offer. It's a retreat dressed as a settlement. She set the letter down. They came in wanting the acreage. Now they want a right of way. The dollar amount doesn't matter. What matters is that they've moved. She looked at him. Your letter worked. Our letter. She accepted that with a small nod. We have a witness, and they're guessing we have a document examiner in progress. She tapped the letter. This is Carver telling us that he'd rather contain the damage now than risk what happens if this goes to a judge who takes fraud seriously. So we take the $400 and the easement. She looked at him. We don't take anything, he said before she could answer. I already know what you're going to say. What am I going to say? That if we settle, they do this to the next rancher, and the one after that. Something crossed her face, not surprise, but a quality of attention that was different from usual, like a door opening a few more inches. Yes, she said. That's what I was going to say. Then we don't settle. She was quiet for a moment. It means going to court. It means what I wrote to Carver, that we file the fraud claim, that we call Aldred, that Birch testifies. It means standing up in front of a judge with Meridian's lawyers on the other side of the room. She paused. It will not be easy. I didn't expect it to be. She held his gaze. Then she picked up Carver's letter and set it aside, off the main pile of working documents, with the deliberate finality of something being decided. I need 3 more days, she said. Then we're ready to file. That's Edmund Birch arrived on a Tuesday. He was younger than Gideon expected, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the careful hands of a man who worked with fine instruments and the slightly distracted manner of someone whose attention was generally more interested in the problem in front of him than in the people around him. He had ridden from Helena in 2 days, which was faster than Gideon had asked for, and which he explained, without elaboration, as having rearranged his schedule. Evelyn had the original deed and the survey ledger laid out on the table when Birch arrived, anchored at the corners with smooth stones from the creek, not touching the documents themselves, just holding them flat. She had thought about how to present the materials. Gideon had seen her think about it, moving things on the table and moving them back, in the way she sometimes worked through problems with her hands when her mind was ahead of her words. Birch sat down, unpacked a leather case of instruments that Gideon didn't have names for, and began to examine the notation. He didn't speak for a long time. Evelyn sat across from him and also didn't speak, which was a specific kind of discipline because Gideon could feel her wanting to ask and choosing not to. He stood near the stove and watched both of them and kept his own counsel. After 40 minutes, Birch said without looking up, "The notation is in iron gall ink." "Yes," Evelyn said. "The surrounding text, the primary survey description, is also iron gall." He adjusted the lens he was using. "Different formulation. The tannin concentration is lower in the notation, which is consistent with a later manufacture date. Post-1880, almost certainly, possibly as late as 1884 or 85. He looked up for the first time. "The original survey is dated 1878. "Yes," Evelyn said again. "Who else has examined this?" "No one. Before you." Birch looked at the notation again. "The letter forms are close to the primary surveyor's hand. Someone practiced to imitate, but the pen angle is slightly different, steeper by a few degrees." He set down the lens. "In my professional opinion, this notation was not written at the time of the original survey. It was added later by a different hand using ink of a later manufacture date in deliberate imitation of the original surveyor's writing style." The stove ticked. Outside, one of the horses moved in the barn. "Will you put that in writing?" Evelyn said. "I'll put it in a formal examination report suitable for court submission." Birch began packing his instruments with the same careful efficiency he'd unpacked them. "I'll need 2 days to write it properly. I'll send it from Helena by the end of the week." He looked up at Gideon. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The imitation is good. A non-specialist wouldn't catch it. He paused. But good isn't good enough when someone knows what to look for. He glanced at Evelyn when he said it. Not pointedly, just accurately. He was gone within the hour. The cabin felt different after he left. Quieter, but not emptily quiet. The quiet of a room where something has just been confirmed that both people already believed and needed someone else to say aloud. Gideon said, "That's 3. Aldred's testimony, Birch's examination report, and your documentation on the other 4 claims." "And the boundary marker," Evelyn said. "We have Walt's witness statement on the section number discrepancy. He agreed to sign it." "I didn't know you'd asked Walt." "Last week when you were in Helena." She looked at him. "I should have told you first. I'm sorry." It was the second time she had apologized to him without hedging it, and like the first time it landed with a weight that had nothing to do with the content of the apology and everything to do with what it meant that she gave them cleanly without architecture around them. "Don't apologize," he said. "Walt would have said yes regardless." "I know, but it was your neighbor to ask." He looked at her for a moment, at the careful woman who had arrived in his house carrying 2 trunks, one of them full of months of preparation, who reorganized kitchen shelves and named chickens, and read his survey records during a blizzard and wrote letters to retired surveyors 8 months before she'd answered his advertisement, and who was also apparently a person who kept track of whose neighbor was whose to ask. "We need to file before Carver realizes Birch came here," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll have the filing documents complete tonight." She worked through the night. He woke at 2 in the morning, and the lamp was still burning, and she was still at the table. And he got up without speaking and put more wood on the fire and made coffee and set a cup beside her and went back to bed. When he woke at 5, she was asleep at the table with her head on her folded arms, pen still in her hand, and the documents were stacked beside her in a neat pile with a smooth creek stone on top. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. She looked younger asleep. The careful watchfulness went out of her face, and what was left was just a person, tired and human, and nothing like the composed, measured woman who met every situation with the equanimity of someone who had decided long ago not to be caught off guard. He thought about the marriage she'd described, the charming man who had spent 4 years taking things from her. He thought about 6 years in an Albany legal office, building knowledge that the world had no immediate use for. He thought about the letter she'd sent to a retired surveyor under no name, 8 months before she had answered a frontier marriage advertisement from a man she'd never met. He went and started breakfast quietly enough not to wake her, and when the smell of coffee and cornbread reached her, she stirred, and he heard the small sound of a person remembering where they were and then gathering themselves. And when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face was composed again in about the time it took to draw one breath. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "Breakfast? Let me sleep." "You needed to sleep." "I needed to finish the—" "It's finished," he said. "You finished it. The pile's right there." She looked at the pile, then at him, a beat of something that she didn't name, and neither did he. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something." She sat down. They rode into Helena together, which was not the plan they had started with, but which became the plan when Gideon looked at the documents and the road ahead and decided that sending her alone was something he was not willing to do and couldn't properly justify beyond that. He told her as much. She said, "I'm capable of filing documents without supervision." "I know you are." "Then why?" "Because I want to be there," he said. "That's all." She looked at him for a moment with the measuring expression that he had learned by now was not evaluation so much as adjustment, recalibrating what she expected from him, updating her internal record of who he was. "All right," she said. The ride to Helena took most of a day. They didn't talk constantly. They had developed, over 2 months of shared space and mounting pressure, the ability to be near each other without filling every silence, which is a thing that takes some people years and some people never. At one point, coming through the canyon section where the trail narrowed and the rock walls rose on both sides, she said, "Are you afraid?" He thought about it. Of losing the land? Of the courtroom, the lawyers, being in a room where they're all looking at you. He considered that honestly. "I don't love it. Never have been easy around men who use a lot of words to say simple things. Carver uses a lot of words." "I figured." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to have to do most of the talking." "I know." "You'll need to let me." He looked at her. "Evelyn, when have I stopped you from doing anything?" She absorbed that, then faintly, around the edges of her mouth. "The first morning. You tried to tell me I didn't need to make breakfast. I tried to tell you that you didn't have to. That's different." She looked ahead at the trail. "It is different," she said. And that was all she said, but it was said in a tone that was different from most of the tones she used, softer at the edges, without the usual careful construction around it. They rode on through the canyon. Chug. The Cascade County Courthouse was a two-story stone building that managed to communicate both the ambition of the territory and the reality of what the territory could actually afford. The clerk's office was on the ground floor, staffed by a man named Ogden, who had the harried efficiency of someone who processed more paperwork than was reasonable and had long since stopped being interested in its contents. Evelyn set the filing documents on his counter and explained what they were with the brisk clarity of a woman who had done this in another life and remembered exactly how it worked. Ogden looked at the stack, looked at her, looked at Gideon, and began processing with the mechanical competence of his trade. The fraud claim went in alongside the boundary challenge. The moment the clerk stamped the filing, something shifted in the room that was hard to name. Not victory, nothing like that yet, and both of them knew it. But the shift from defense to offense, from responding to acting, from being the people something was happening to being the people doing something about it. Gideon felt it in his chest, small and quiet and real. He looked at Evelyn. She was watching Ogden organize the documents with the focused attention she gave everything, but he saw her exhale once, slowly, through her nose. The almost invisible exhale of a person who has been holding something for a long time. They were outside on the courthouse steps when Gideon said, "Now what?" "Now Carver gets served," she said, "and then we wait to see how he responds to the fraud claim." She squinted into the pale winter light. "He has two options. He can fight it, which means a hearing before a judge where we present Birch's report and Aldred's testimony and the pattern documentation. Or he can settle on terms that are actually acceptable. Which do you think he'll do?" She thought about it without hurrying. "I don't know," she said, which was one of the things he trusted about her, that she didn't dress up uncertainty in confident language. He's smart enough to know the fraud claim changes the picture, but he's also representing a company with a great deal of money and a great deal of habit. People with that much of both don't always make the sensible choice. Then we may be going to a hearing. We may. Gideon looked out at the Helena street. Wagons, foot traffic, a dog sleeping in a patch of thin February sun with the devoted commitment of something with no other obligations. "I want to go see Aldred while we're here," he said. "Tell him it's filed." "That's a good idea," she said. "He should know." They found Aldred at home. He opened the door and looked at them, the two of them together on his step, and something in his face shifted with the quality of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and was being told he could set it down, not yet, but soon. He made coffee. They sat at the small table. Gideon told him what had been filed. Aldred listened without interrupting, which was the courtesy of a man who understood that the person talking had earned the right to finish. When Gideon was done, Aldred said, "Birch's report." "End of the week." Aldred nodded, looked at Evelyn. "The pattern documentation, the other 4 claims." "Attached to the filing," she said. "All 4. Wyoming, Dakota Territory, the survey dates, the notation comparisons." Aldred wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at something that wasn't in the room, some interior landscape that Gideon couldn't see and didn't try to. "I've been thinking about what I should have done in 1889, he said. "When that man came with the copies and I told him the notation wasn't mine." He paused. "I should have written it down then, made a formal statement, put it somewhere official." "You didn't know yet what they were building," Evelyn said. "No, but I knew something was wrong." He looked at his coffee. "That should have been enough." The room was quiet for a moment. "It's enough now," Gideon said. Aldred looked at him. Then he nodded once with the gravity of a man making a decision he had been approaching for years. "Tell me when the hearing is scheduled," he said. "I'll be there." Carver's response came faster than either of them expected. Not 4 days after the filing, a letter arrived at the ranch. Not through a messenger on a fast horse this time, but through the regular mail, which Gideon took as a signal in itself. The urgency had changed its costume. The letter was 3 pages. It was measured and professional, and it said, in the careful language of a man choosing his words with awareness that they might be examined later, that Carver and Stroud had reviewed the filing and were prepared to enter into good faith discussions regarding the resolution of all outstanding matters between the Northern Cascade Railroad and Gideon Ashcroft. All outstanding matters, not the boundary dispute. All outstanding matters. Evelyn read the letter at the table and then read it again and then set it down. He's trying to consolidate, she said. Get everything into one negotiation so he can control the shape of it. Is that bad? It means he doesn't want a hearing, which means he's worried about what happens at one. She was quiet for a moment. It also means he's willing to give more than the right-of-way easement. How much more? That's what we need to find out. She looked at the letter. He's proposing a meeting, here, in Helena, with representatives from Meridian present. She looked at him. He'll have lawyers in that room. Good ones. They'll be looking for any point of weakness in our position. We respond? We respond, but we set the terms. She picked up her pen. The meeting is in Helena. Aldred attends as a material witness present for consultation. Birch's written report is presented at the opening of the meeting before any discussion begins. She looked at him. And you and I go together. I do the talking. You sit next to me. But I can live with that arrangement. She looked at him over the top of her pen. You've been remarkably good about that, she said. The arrangement. You're better at this than I am. Yes, she said without false modesty. But most men would have had trouble with it regardless. He shrugged. Most men didn't have the option of someone who actually knows what they're doing. He paused. I'm not going to be stubborn about something just to feel useful. She looked at him for a moment in that recalibrating way. Douglas, my first husband, would have taken over the moment we walked into a lawyer's office, she said. Not because he knew more, because the alternative was intolerable to him. Then he was a fool, Gideon said. She didn't answer that. But she looked down at the paper she was writing on, and he saw the set of her jaw change slightly, soften at the edges, the way a held tension releases when the holding is no longer necessary. She wrote the response to Carver that evening. She read it to him when it was done. Not for approval, he understood, but because they had crossed some threshold in the past 2 months where sharing things had stopped requiring a reason. He listened and said it sounded right, and she sealed it, and it went out with the morning mail. The meeting was set for a Friday, 12 days later. Those 12 days had their own texture. Birch's report arrived on schedule, 8 dense pages of technical examination that Evelyn read twice and summarized into a single clear page that she intended to open the meeting with. Aldred sent a confirmation that he would attend. Walt came by twice. Once to check on things, and once, Gideon suspected, simply because the situation had become the kind of thing Walt found impossible to stay away from. You think they'll fold? Walt asked on the second visit. I think they'll negotiate, Gideon said. What's the difference? Folding is when they give you what you want. Negotiating is when they give you most of what you want and try to make you feel like you gave something back. He paused. Evelyn says we want the fraud claim withdrawn with prejudice, the corrective survey vacated, and a public record correction removing the annotation from the deed. Walt blinked. And the $400? We're not taking their money. Walt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked toward the cabin, where Evelyn was visible through the window, working at the table. That woman, he said, is something else entirely. Yes, Gideon said. You knew that when she stepped off the stage. Gideon thought about a woman stepping off a stage in freezing darkness and looking at Harlow Creek with calm, inventory eyes. Not then, he said, but close to. They rode to Helena the day before the meeting and stayed at a rooming house near the courthouse. Evelyn had brought one of her trunks, not the evidence trunk, but the other one, the one she had never fully unpacked, and Gideon understood when she came down to the rooming house parlor the next morning that the trunk contained the clothes she had brought for exactly this kind of occasion. A dark wool dress, precisely maintained, with a jacket that had the cut of something made for professional life. She had her hair up, and she wore the expression she wore when she was about to walk into something difficult, which was no expression at all, just the steady, prepared face of a woman who had learned to give nothing away until she chose to. Gideon was in his best coat, which was clean, but was still a rancher's coat, and he was aware of the contrast and didn't apologize for it. He was what he was. The land was what it was. That was the whole point. Aldred was waiting outside the building where Carver had arranged the meeting, a rented office near the Land Records Bureau, neutral ground that wasn't neutral. He looked at Evelyn when they arrived and said, "You look like you're ready." "I've been ready for 8 months," she said. Aldred almost smiled. Inside, the room was arranged as Gideon had expected. A long table, Carver's team on one side. 3 lawyers from Helena, a man introduced as the regional director of Meridian Land and Survey Trust, and a 4th man who was introduced as a surveying consultant, and who was not Calvin Reed, which meant Carver had decided Reed was a liability and quietly set him aside. That alone told Gideon something. Carver was exactly as he'd imagined from the letters. 50s, silver-haired, with the polished manner of a man who had been the smartest person in most rooms for long enough that he'd stopped checking. He looked at Evelyn when she came in, and something passed between them that Gideon couldn't entirely read. The recognition of 2 people who had known each other in a previous context and were now on opposite sides of a table. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Carver said. "Mr. Carver," Evelyn said. They sat down. Evelyn placed Birch's summary page on the table in front of her and said, "Before we begin, I'd like to enter into the record that we have a formal examination report from Edmund Birch, document examiner for the Cascade County Territory Courts, confirming that the marginal notation in the survey deed for Section 14, Township 8 North, was added after the original filing by a different hand using ink of a later manufacture date. Mr. Birch's full report is available for review." She set a copy in the center of the table. "I'd also like to note the presence of Thomas Aldred, the original surveyor of the 1878 land grants in this territory, who has confirmed under his professional signature that the notation does not appear in his original field notes or his filed survey." She set Aldred's signed statement next to Birch's summary. The Meridian Regional Director looked at the papers and then at Carver. Carver's face remained professional and still, but Gideon was watching his hands and his hands had tightened. "Additionally," Evelyn continued, "we have documented 4 prior instances of corrective survey claims filed by Meridian Land and Survey Trust in Wyoming and Dakota Territory, each involving a materially similar marginal notation in original survey documents. This documentation has been filed with our fraud claim and has been shared with the Office of the Territory Attorney General." The Territory Attorney General. She had not mentioned the Attorney General to Gideon. He sat very still and did not look at her and did not react, because she had given him the one instruction she'd been clear about, and he was keeping it. Carver said, "The Attorney General's office has been contacted?" "Last week," Evelyn said. "As a matter of courtesy, given the public records implications of the fraud claim." The Meridian Director leaned toward Carver and said something low and fast. Carver's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A recalculation, visible only in the slight pause before he arranged his next sentence. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "I think we can find a resolution here that serves everyone's interests." "I'm certain we can," she said. "The resolution we're prepared to accept is the complete withdrawal of the corrective boundary survey claim, the vacation of the temporary easement injunction, and the formal removal of the notation from the deed record by order of the Territory Court." She folded her hands on the table. "We are not seeking monetary damages at this time. We are seeking a clean record." At this time. 2 words that Carver heard as clearly as everything else. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the director, who had the expression of a man whose morning had not gone the way his morning was supposed to go. Then at Aldred, who sat at the end of the table with the quiet stillness of a man who has made his decision and is at peace with it. Then at the papers in the center of the table, Birch's 8 pages of careful technical language, Aldred's signed statement, the copies of 4 prior claims with their pattern of identical style notations. He looked at all of it. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "I'll need to confer with my client," he said. "Of course," she said. "We'll wait." They were shown to a side room. Aldred sat down immediately, with the relief of a man whose legs were not as young as his resolve. Gideon stood near the window. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and said nothing. After a moment, Gideon said quietly, "The Attorney General." I contacted his office 9 days ago, she said. They're reviewing the documentation. I don't know yet what they'll do with it, but Carver doesn't know that I don't know, and in a negotiation, what the other side believes you have matters as much as what you actually have. Gideon looked at her. You gambled, he said. Carefully, she said. He thought about that. About the difference between a reckless gamble and a calculated one, and about the fact that everything she had done since arriving in his house had been calibrated within an inch of its life, and about how even the gambles she took were built on months of preparation. What if he calls it? Gideon said. What if he says, prove it? Show me the AG's response. I show him my letter to the AG and my confirmation of receipt, she said, which is exactly what I have. It's the truth. What I don't have is a commitment from the AG's office, which is also the truth, which is why I said it the way I said it. Aldred from his chair said, she said they were reviewing the documentation, which they are. Which they are, she confirmed. The side room was quiet. Outside, through the wall, Gideon could hear the low murmur of Carver conferring with his clients, though not the words. 12 minutes passed. He counted them without meaning to, which was what happened when he was in situations where there was nothing useful to do with his hands. On the 13th minute, the door opened and Carver's junior associate said they were ready to resume. They sat back down. Carver said, Meridian is prepared to withdraw the corrective boundary survey claim and vacate the temporary injunction. He said it with the controlled delivery of a man saying something that costs him, slowly, so the cost doesn't show. We will also agree not to contest the formal notation removal from the deed record, subject to a standard procedural filing. Evelyn said, and the 4 prior claims in Wyoming and Dakota Territory? A pause. Those claims are outside the scope of this proceeding, Carver said. They are, Evelyn said. They're within the scope of the Attorney General's review. Another pause, longer. Meridian will cooperate with any territory review of prior land proceedings, Carver said carefully, which was lawyer language for, we will not fight what we cannot afford to fight in public. Evelyn looked at Gideon, just briefly, just for a beat. He gave her nothing visible, but he felt something move in his chest that was not complicated and not sophisticated, and was simply the feeling of a man watching someone do something remarkable and knowing he was the only person in the room who fully understood what it had cost her to get here. She looked back at Carver. We accept those terms, she said. The paperwork took 2 hours. Gideon signed where he was told to sign. Evelyn reviewed every page before she let him, quickly but completely, because that was who she was. Aldred witnessed the primary document with the careful signature of a man who had been waiting years to put his name on the right side of something. When it was done, Carver stood and extended his hand to Evelyn with the professional courtesy of a man who has lost cleanly and knows it and is not going to compound it by being graceless. She shook it. They said nothing to each other that hadn't already been said. Outside on the Helena Street in the pale afternoon light of a February that was finally starting to feel like it might eventually end, the 3 of them stood on the steps, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Aldred said, I'd like to buy you both dinner. You don't have to do that, Gideon said. I've been waiting to do something useful for 6 years, Aldred said. Let me buy dinner. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the street with the expression she got when she was letting something settle. Not the careful blankness, not the measuring gaze, but something quieter and less constructed, the face of a person who has finished carrying something and hasn't yet decided what to do with the empty hands. All right, she said. Dinner. They walked down the steps into the street, the retired surveyor and the rancher and the woman who had come west with 2 trunks and a body of knowledge and a plan that had just, piece by piece, held together long enough to work, and the February cold was sharp and clean around them, and above the Helena rooftops the sky was going the color. It goes just before dark when there are no clouds, that particular deep cold blue that has no name, but that anyone who has spent a Montana winter knows as well as their own breathing. Gideon walked beside her and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the ground under his feet was where he had put it. The ride home from Helena took longer than it should have, not because anything went wrong on the road. The horses were rested, the trail was passable, the weather held with the grudging neutrality of a Montana February that had temporarily run out of storms. It took longer because neither of them was in a hurry, which was something Gideon noticed about halfway through the canyon section, and then noticed that he'd noticed, which was the kind of circular awareness that came from 2 months of living in close quarters with a person who made you more conscious of your own habits. They stopped at the creek crossing to water the horses and stood in the thin afternoon light without needing to fill it with words, and Gideon thought about how strange that was, how quickly and how quietly it had happened, this ability to simply be near each other. It had not been there when she stepped off the stage in December. It had been built out of blizzard hours and fence line work, and the specific intimacy of shared fear, the way soldiers sometimes describe bonding not in the good moments, but in the long, grinding, difficult ones, when people show you who they actually are because they've run out of the energy it takes to be someone else. He was not a man who thought in those terms, usually, but he was thinking in them now. Evelyn was looking at the water moving under the ice at the edge of the creek, where the current was too fast to freeze solid. She had her gloves off. She always took her gloves off when she was thinking, he had noticed, as if direct contact with the cold helped her concentrate. "What happens to the other 4 ranchers?" he said. She looked up. "The ones in Wyoming and Dakota Territory who settled with Meridian," he said. "The 3 who took the deal." She looked back at the water. "The Attorney General's review, if it moves forward, will examine all the prior claims." She paused. "Whether that results in anything for those landowners, I don't know. The law doesn't always move backward as well as it moves forward. A beat. It should, but it doesn't always. That's not fair." "No," she said simply. "It's not." He thought about 3 ranchers in other territories who had looked at Meridian's lawyers and their documents and their money and had made the calculation that fighting was too expensive, and who had been right about that calculation because nobody on their side had known what to look for. He thought about what Evelyn had said once, that wisdom and courage were different things, that knowing when to fight and when to survive were both forms of intelligence, and that the men who settled hadn't failed. They'd just been alone in a way that Gideon, without knowing it, hadn't been, because she had come. Not for him, not exactly, not at first, but she had come, and she had stayed, and that amounted to the same thing in ways that were difficult to articulate, and that he found he didn't need to articulate right now. "We should go," she said, pulling her gloves back on. "Yeah," he said. They rode home. The Territory Attorney General's formal review was announced 6 weeks later. It came as a brief notice in the Helena Courier, which Pete Dobbs' boy delivered with the regular mail on a Wednesday morning in late March, folded inside a letter from Aldred that said simply, "Saw the notice. It's moving. T.A." The notice said that the Office of the Territory Attorney General was opening a formal inquiry into survey documentation practices by the Meridian Land and Survey Trust and its affiliated entities in connection with land title proceedings in 3 territories over a period of 7 years. The inquiry would examine the integrity of survey records filed with the territory land offices and would include interviews with current and former Meridian personnel. Gideon read it at the table and passed it to Evelyn. She read it once, set it down. "Calvin Reed," she said. "What about him?" "He's the surveyor who signed the affidavit for Meridian, the one who claimed the notation was original." She looked at the notice. "When the Attorney General's office interviews him, he has a choice. He can maintain that position, which is perjury if the examination report proves otherwise, or he can tell them what he knows. Which is? That someone at Meridian asked him to sign an affidavit about a document he hadn't personally examined." She tapped the notice. "He didn't forge the notation. I don't think he even knew it was forged. He was handed a document and a statement and told to sign." Gideon thought about that, about a man who had signed something without asking enough questions, and about where those kinds of decisions led, and about the different ways people became complicit in things without being the author of them. Will he cooperate? "A man facing a perjury charge usually finds cooperation appealing," she said, without particular satisfaction in her voice. Just the flat accuracy of someone stating how things generally worked. If he cooperates, the trail leads somewhere inside Meridian that's above his level. Someone who identified the properties, orchestrated the notation alterations, directed the survey claims. She paused. "That's who the Attorney General actually wants." "Harlan," Gideon said. The name from his memory, the man who had come to his door 3 years ago with the first offer to buy, in the polished coat and the flat-eyed patience. Evelyn looked at him. Was that his full name? Harlan what? I don't know. I never asked. He thought back. Harlan. He said he was from the investment company. She nodded slowly. It may be enough to identify him. The AG's office will find him if he's findable. A pause. And if he's not findable, that tells its own story. They sat with the notice between them on the table. Outside, through the oilcloth window that had been replaced with actual glass in the first week of March, because Gideon had finally ordered it from Harlow Creek, something he had been putting off for 2 years, which Evelyn had noted without comment. The late March light was different from what it had been. Still cold, but angled differently. The specific angle of a winter that is beginning to consider ending. It's enough, Gideon said. What we did, the filing, the review, it's enough. She looked at him. I mean for us, he said, whatever the Attorney General does from here. We got the land back, we got the record cleaned, we put it in front of people who had the authority to take it further. He paused. That's what we could do. We did it. She was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. We did. It was not a grand statement. It didn't have the shape of a conclusion that movie people would make, standing in a courthouse with flags behind them. It was 2 people at a kitchen table in late March with cold coffee and a newspaper notice, and the particular quiet satisfaction of having finished a hard thing that had needed doing. Gideon thought that was probably the truest kind of satisfaction there was. Spring in that valley was not a gentle arrival. It was an argument. March fought February for every degree of temperature. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat grudgingly from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind the mud that was in some ways harder to work in than the frozen ground had been. The creek rose and ran dark and fast with snowmelt. 2 fence posts on the north pasture heaved out of the ground entirely from frost movement and had to be reset. One of the horses picked up a stone bruise that put him out of work for 10 days. The chickens, apparently offended by the transitional weather, reduced their laying to a stubborn trickle that Evelyn took as a personal challenge. None of it was easy. None of it was supposed to be. But the quality of the difficulty was different from the winter's difficulty, and Gideon understood, working alongside Evelyn in the March mud, that this was the kind of hard that was simply the cost of making something grow, as opposed to the kind of hard that was someone trying to take something from you. The first kind was just work. It had always been just work. It was the second kind that had been eating him, slowly, for years. The grinding awareness that what he'd built could be taken, that the ground under him was contested, that the solitude he'd constructed wasn't peace, but defense. That was gone now. Not because everything was easy, not because the ranch had become something it wasn't, but because the threat that had been underneath everything for longer than he'd known had been named and faced and removed, and what was left was just the work, which he had always been capable of, and which was, when it wasn't layered over with fear, something close to what he would have called contentment, if he had been a man more comfortable with that word. He was getting more comfortable with it. One afternoon in early April, Evelyn found him at the south fence line doing repair work that he'd told her he was doing and that she had found him doing, which meant no detour into checking on him, which he appreciated. She had brought him coffee in the battered tin that lived on the fence post during working hours, and she stood and drank her own while he worked, and after a while she said, "I want to write to the rancher in Wyoming." He looked up. The one who lost the case. He lost on a procedural issue. The actual evidence he had may have been enough. She held her cup. "I want to send him what we built, the full documentation, the pattern comparison, Birch's methodology. If the Attorney General's review creates an opening for him to refile, he'll need to know what tools are available," Gideon said. "Yes." He looked at her. She was squinting into the April light, which was coming through the bare aspens at a low angle and catching the edge of her face, and she looked tired in the way she often looked in the afternoon, when the tiredness she didn't acknowledge in the morning had accumulated to the point where it showed. She also looked, underneath the tiredness, like someone who had a purpose and knew what it was, which was a different quality from how she had looked when she arrived. Not more capable, She had always been capable, but less braced against the possibility that the capability would go unused. "Do it," he said. She looked at him. "It'll take time. It's not—" "I know it's not about the ranch," he said. "Do it anyway." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the aspens and drank her coffee, and Gideon went back to the fence post, and that was that. But it wasn't that exactly, and they both knew it. It was the moment. Unmarked, undramatic, arriving sideways the way the real moments usually did, when Gideon Ashcroft told his wife that her work mattered, and that he would not make her small to preserve his own sense of proportion. It was a simple thing. It should not have been remarkable. But Evelyn Harrow had lived long enough with the alternative to know that simple things that should not be remarkable sometimes were, and she carried that moment with her for a long time afterward. Walt Pruitt came to dinner in April, when the trail between their places had dried enough to make the ride reasonable. He came with a jar of his neighbor May Tilson's preserved plums, which was his standard contribution to any meal he didn't cook himself, and which Evelyn received with the same expression she received most things: attentive, unperformative, actually pleased in a way that didn't need to announce itself. Over dinner, Walt talked about the Courier article that had appeared the previous week, a longer piece than the original notice, detailing the scope of the Attorney General's inquiry and the involvement of what the article called a senior land agent who had since been identified, leaving his position at Meridian, and whose whereabouts were, according to the article, currently being determined by investigators. "Harlan," Gideon said. Walt looked at him. "You knew him?" "He came here once, 3 years ago." Walt ate a piece of the salt pork Evelyn had prepared and chewed it thoughtfully. "Pete Dobbs says the whole valley's talking about it. Folks didn't know they were targets. A couple of the smaller homesteaders east of here are having their records looked at now." He glanced at Evelyn. "Your name's come up. People are asking who did the legal work." Evelyn said, "What kind of asking?" "Curious asking," Walt said. "Not the bad kind." He set down his fork. "May Tilson asked me directly, said she heard a woman handled the documents. Said she wanted to know who, in case there was ever something she needed to understand about her own deed." The table was quiet for a moment. "May Tilson can come and talk to me," Evelyn said, "if she has questions about her deed." Walt smiled slowly, in the way he smiled at things that pleased him before he'd decided whether to say so. "I'll tell her that." He picked up his fork again. "What about the others? There's the Hadley family east of the canyon, old Perkins on the north side." "One at a time," Evelyn said. "If people have questions, they can come." Gideon said nothing. He was looking at the table and thinking about something Walt had said. People are asking who did the legal work. And about the woman across from him who had arrived in December with 2 trunks and careful eyes, and a body of knowledge that the world she'd grown up in had trained her for and then had no place for, and who had found, in a valley at the edge of the frontier, a place where it was needed in ways that went beyond one deed and one annotation and one railroad company's long habit of taking what didn't belong to them. He thought about something she had said to him months ago during the blizzard. "I came because I needed somewhere to go and because I thought I might be able to help." He thought those two things were no longer as separate as they'd been when she said them. Eat. The wood carving had been started in February during the week after the meeting in Helena, in the specific way that Gideon did things when he had energy left over from processing something significant and no other good place to put it. He had always worked with his hands in the evenings, mending, sharpening, the small maintenance work of a ranch. But this was different. A piece of cedar he'd split from a fence post off-cut that had a grain he hadn't been able to bring himself to use for a post. He worked on it in the evenings while Evelyn wrote her letters, and he did not tell her what it was going to be, partly because he wasn't entirely sure himself until it was almost finished, and partly because he was unaccustomed to being watched in the process of making something that had no practical purpose. He finished it on a Saturday evening in late April, when the window glass was showing the last of the day's light and the fire had burned to a comfortable steady heat, and Evelyn had put down her pen and was simply sitting, which she did occasionally, just sitting, without reading or writing or working, in the way of someone who had only recently rediscovered that sitting without purpose was allowed. He got up from the corner where he'd been working and set it on the table in front of her. It was a bluebird, small, maybe 4 inches from tail to beak, carved from the cedar with a detail that surprised him when he looked at it fresh. The feathers suggested more than rendered, the head tilted slightly the way actual bluebirds tilted their heads, as if perpetually on the edge of deciding something. Evelyn looked at it. She picked it up and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was how she looked at things she was taking seriously. "It's a bluebird," she said. "I know what it is. You made this." "Over the last couple months." He sat back down. "In the evenings." She turned it in her hands. "Why a bluebird?" He thought about that. He had a real answer, and he was going to have to decide whether to give it. "There's a thing that happens in spring here," he said. "When the bluebirds come back to the valley. They show up before almost anything else, before the real warmth, before the grass comes back. They're just there one morning, like they never left. Like they knew the whole time that the valley was going to be fine, and they were just waiting on it to catch up." He paused. Clara loved them. She used to watch for them from the window. Evelyn looked at the carving and then at him, with the open expression she had, the one without the careful management over it, the one he'd been seeing more of since February. "I used to think they just reminded me of her," he said. "But last week one showed up on the fence post by the barn, and I stood and watched it for a while, and I realized—" He stopped, got it cleaner. "I realized that what I always felt when I saw them wasn't grief. It was something more like being reminded that things come back, that the valley comes back, that you can get through the winter if you just—" He shook his head slightly. "It doesn't matter what it means. I just wanted to make you something that was actually mine to give." Evelyn set the bluebird down on the table in front of her and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him, and what was on her face was not the careful, composed expression and was not the open, unguarded expression. It was something else, something quieter and more decided, the face of a person who has weighed something carefully over a long time and has reached the end of the weighing. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." "When I answered your advertisement," she said, "I told myself it was practical, that I had a skill that was needed here and a situation that suited me, and that was sufficient reason." She looked at the bluebird. "And that was true. It was all true." She paused. "But I also read your advertisement 17 times before I answered it." He looked at her. "Not because the language was complicated," she said. "Because—" She stopped, tried again. "It said no illusions offered, no illusions expected, and I had been lied to by the time I read that, in enough different ways by enough different people that the absence of a lie felt like the most remarkable thing I had encountered in years." She picked up the bluebird again, held it. "I came because I could help, and I came because a man who put that in his advertisement seemed like someone worth trying to know." The fire breathed. The window light had gone to the particular deep blue of an April evening. Outside, something, a nightbird, the first of the season, made a single sound and was quiet. "I'm not easy to know," Gideon said. "No," she agreed. "But you're worth it," which is what I said and what I found to be accurate. He looked at her across the table. The woman who had reorganized his kitchen shelf and named his chickens and worked fence line in February cold and read his survey records during a blizzard and written letters by lamplight that saved his land and spent the last 5 months being the most competent and complicated and honest person he had shared space with since Clara, who had been different in every way, except in the essential way, which was that she had made him feel like the person he actually was someone worth being. He said, "I wasn't looking for a partner when I placed that advertisement." "I know." "I thought I was just looking for someone to manage the practical side, someone who could handle the ranch when I couldn't, someone to—" He stopped. "I thought I was tired of being alone, and that was all." "And now?" He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Now I think being tired of being alone and being ready for something real are two different things," he said. "And I think I was ready for the second one and didn't know it." Evelyn looked at him with the clear, undecorated gaze that had been one of the first things he'd noticed about her. The gaze that didn't ask for anything and didn't offer anything and simply saw what was there. "Me too," she said, That was all. 2 words, from a woman who chose them carefully, which meant they carried everything she intended and nothing she didn't. The formal court order restoring the deed record, the notation officially removed, the corrected boundary vacated, the original 1878 survey reinstated as the governing document, arrived on a Tuesday in May when the valley was green in a way that always surprised Gideon even after 11 years. Every May the same surprise, as if the winter were always more convincing than he expected, and the spring always more determined. He brought the document inside and set it on the table. Evelyn read it and then did something she didn't often do. She folded it neatly and held it for a moment, just held it in her hands, with her eyes closed. Not praying, not performing anything, just a person holding something hard-won and taking a moment to feel the weight of it before deciding what to do with it next. Then she opened her eyes and got up and put the document in the larger trunk, the one that had held the evidence, next to the copies of the Wyoming and Dakota Territory claims, and Birch's examination report, and Aldred's signed statement and all the letters she had written and received in the cold months of that long winter. She closed the trunk. "That's where it belongs," she said. Gideon thought about that, about a trunk full of the record of what had almost happened and what had instead happened, stored away not because it should be forgotten, but because it had done its work and could rest. "Aldred wrote," he said. "He's been contacted by the Attorney General's office. They want his testimony for the broader inquiry." "Good." She turned around. "He'll be glad to give it." "He said to tell you—" Gideon looked at the letter in his hand. "He said to tell you that he's slept better since February than he has in years." Something moved across her face. The almost smile that he had first seen the day he told her the Bible was under the table leg, which had been 4 months ago and felt in some ways like a different life. "I'm glad," she said. And she meant it in the simple, private way she meant things. Not for an audience, not for the sentiment of it. Just glad. Walt brought May Tilson by in the second week of May. May was 62 and had homesteaded her property alone since her husband died in 1884, and had the quality that certain people developed after years of managing everything themselves. A brisk, watchful competence that didn't soften for company, but wasn't unfriendly either. She brought a pie. She sat at Gideon and Evelyn's kitchen table and took out her deed documents and spread them on the table the way Evelyn had spread her own evidence months before, and she said, "Tell me what I'm looking at." Evelyn told her. Clearly, without condescension, with the focused attention she brought to every problem that needed solving. She explained what a marginal notation was. She explained what to look for in the ink. She explained what the survey numbers meant and how to read the boundary descriptions. May listened with complete attention and asked 3 precise questions, which Evelyn answered, and at the end May looked at her documents for a long moment. "Mine looks clean," she said. "It does," Evelyn agreed, "but keep the original. Don't let anyone borrow it or copy it outside of an official records request." May nodded. Then she looked at Evelyn with the measuring gaze of one capable woman assessing another. "Walt told me a little," she said, "about what you did this winter." "We did it," Evelyn said. May glanced at Gideon and back. "Yes," she said, in a tone that suggested she understood exactly what that meant. Then, "Are you going to do this for others?" "What you did. The document examination, the legal challenge." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "If people need it and I can help," she said. "The Hadley family east of the canyon would benefit from talking to you." May folded her deed documents back with the care of someone who had just learned they were more important than she'd realized. And old Perkins has never been sure his title was registered properly. "They can come," Evelyn said. After May and Walt had gone, Gideon washed the cups at the basin, and Evelyn sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood the way she did when she was working something through. "That's not nothing," he said. "What she's asking." "No," Evelyn said. "It's not. It's more than one rancher's deed." "Yes." He turned around and looked at her. "Is that what you want? To keep doing this?" She looked at her hands on the table, then at him. "I don't know exactly what shape it takes," she said honestly. "I know I'm not going back to Albany. I know this valley needs what I can do, and I know—" She paused. "I know I want to be here. Not just because it's useful, because it's home. She said the last word simply, without making a production of it, the way people named things they had earned. This is home. Gideon dried his hands on the cloth by the basin and came and sat across from her at the table. The same table where she had spread her documents, and they had planned their way through an impossible winter. And he looked at her and thought about what that word meant when it came from a woman who had not had it for a long time. He thought about Clara, which he still did sometimes, and probably always would, and had made a kind of peace with. Clara, who had come to Montana for him and found the place harder than she'd hoped. Evelyn, who had come to Montana for her own reasons and had made the place harder for the people who deserved it and easier for the ones who didn't. Two different women and two different stories, and one man who had been shaped by both of them in ways he was still, slowly, understanding. He was not going to pretend he was healed of everything. He wasn't. He was 51 years old with a shoulder that would never be right, and a piece of ground that had cost him more than he could total, and a first wife buried in the South Meadow, and 3 years of practiced isolation that had become so habitual he hadn't known what it was until someone arrived and changed the quality of the rooms. But here was a woman across from him who had said, "This is home," and meant it, who had brought order to his kitchen shelf, and evidence to his legal fight, and names to his chickens, and who had shaken Carver's hand in a Helena office and won back what was his with nothing but the truth and the preparation to prove it. Here was a woman who had sat across from him in a blizzard and told him that honesty was more durable than kindness, who had been right about that, and about most things she had said with certainty, and who was honest enough to be uncertain about the things she didn't know yet. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "The cabin needs a proper window on the north side," he said. "Better light in the afternoon. And the barn needs an additional stall. I've been thinking about expanding the stock in summer." He paused. "And there's a room off the back that I've been using for storage that doesn't need to be storage." She looked at him steadily. "I'm saying the place needs work," he said. "Real work. The kind that makes it worth more than just getting through the winter." "I know what you're saying," she said. "I'm not good at—" He stopped. Tried again. "I built this place to survive. That was always the goal. Survive the winter, survive the low prices, survive losing Clara." He looked at her. "I've been surviving for 11 years, and I'm tired of that being the whole of it." The May light was coming through the new window glass at the angle it came in this month, the angle that Clara had said was the best light in the cabin, and Evelyn was sitting in it the way she sat in all light, without performing anything, just present in the room, occupying the space without apology. "Then we build something," she said. Not a question. A statement of intent. From a woman who made decisions the same way she did everything else. Carefully, completely, and without taking them back. Gideon nodded. Outside on the fence post by the barn, a bluebird had taken up a position in the mid-morning sun and was sitting with the absolute settled confidence of something that had migrated across 1,000 miles to get back to exactly the right place. It tilted its head the way bluebirds tilted their heads, as if the valley were a question worth considering, and then it decided in the way birds decided things, entirely without reservation, and it stayed. Gideon had seen this every spring for 11 years. This was the first year it felt like it was meant for him. There are people who come into your life as transactions. There are people who come as rescue. And then, rarely, there are people who come as something harder to name. Not rescue, because you are already standing. Not transaction, because what passes between you can't be counted. Something more like recognition. Two people seeing each other clearly in the unforgiving light of a Montana winter, and deciding that what they see is worth building on. Neither of them had arrived at this clean. They had carried damage and history and the specific, stubborn scars of people who had survived things by becoming careful. They had mistrusted and withheld and made mistakes and apologized for some of them and not for others. They had fought a real enemy together and come through it and found, on the other side, that they liked who the other person had been in the fighting. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. Evelyn picked up the bluebird carving from the edge of the table where it had been sitting since the previous evening and held it for a moment in the light. "I'll put this somewhere it can be seen," she said. "Kitchen window," Gideon said. "That's the best light." She set it on the kitchen windowsill, on the south side, where the May sun came through the new glass and caught the cedar grain and made it glow with the warmth of something that had been made slowly and carefully by someone who didn't make things like that very often, which was perhaps why it had come out as well as it had. Then she turned back to the room, to the table, and the work, and the man across from it, and the spring that was happening outside the window whether they were ready for it or not. "What needs doing first?" she said. Gideon thought about the north window and the barn stall and the back room and the fence posts that would need checking after the snow melt and the cattle that needed moving and the letter he should write to Aldred and the letter Evelyn would write to Wyoming and everything that was ahead of them, all of it real and none of it easy and all of it, finally, worth doing. "The north fence," he said. "Then the rest." She nodded, got her coat. They went out into the May morning together, and the valley was green and loud with creek water. And the bluebird on the fence post watched them go with the impartial regard of something that had seen many springs and expected to see many more. And the work was waiting, the way work always waited, patient and indifferent and entirely ready for whoever showed up to do it. They showed up. That was the beginning.